At my son's funeral, when the flowers had not even wilted, his ex-wife, who abandoned him 15 years ago, walked in and claimed the $24 million he left behind as if it belonged to her. My chest tightened. The whispers around me cut deeper than the coffin lowering into the ground. I stood there, torn between grief and fury, realizing this betrayal was not just against me but against my son's memory. What followed would tear apart every mask in that room and leave no place to hide. At my son's funeral, when the flowers were still fresh and his favorite hymn had barely finished echoing through the church, she walked in. Veronica Pike, the woman who left him 15 years ago without a single word of goodbye, without a dime of support, without attending a single hospital visit when he was sick. She stepped through the chapel doors in 4-inch heels, a sharp black dress, and a smirk that froze the entire room. Then she spoke, loudly, clearly, like she had rehearsed it. "I am here to claim what belongs to me, the $24 million estate my husband left behind. As his lawful wife, I have every legal right to it." I could feel the air get sucked from the room. Some people gasped, others turned to each other, stunned. But me? I just stared at the coffin. My son's name was carved into the brass plate, shining in the soft candlelight. He hadn't even been in the ground 10 minutes, and she was already clawing at what was left of him. It wasn't sadness that hit me, not at that moment. It was heat, rising in my chest, tightening in my neck, a quiet fury that sat heavy behind my ribs. I didn't turn to look at her, not yet. I kept my eyes on the casket and pressed my palm flat against the fabric of my dress to stop it from shaking. My late husband used to say I had the patience of a stone wall. That day, I needed it. Veronica's lawyer stood next to her, young and nervous, flipping through some papers in a blue folder. I could hear his voice tremble as he mentioned marital status, survivor rights, and some clause in a policy he hadn't read carefully enough. He didn't even know she had signed away every right she had in their divorce settlement all those years ago. I looked to my left. Ruth Calder, my lawyer and the only other person who had known what was coming, gave me a small nod. She was already pulling a folder from her bag. Not the time yet. Just wait. Across the aisle, the whispers had begun. Veronica's entrance hadn't just shattered the silence. It had shattered the illusion of peace. Mourners shifted uncomfortably in their pews. Some looked down. Others stared at me, waiting, as if I would fall apart, as if I would break. But I didn't. I slowly turned to face her. She didn't flinch. Her eyes met mine with the cold confidence of a woman who thought she had won. She raised her chin, clearly proud of herself. Maybe she expected me to cry, to beg, to argue right there in front of the altar, but I didn't move. And maybe that rattled her, because her voice grew louder. "I am not here to fight. I am here to collect what is legally mine." I finally spoke, my voice calm, colder than hers. "You are not his wife. Not anymore." For a second, she hesitated. Her lawyer whispered something, flipping a page, but I could see it in her face. She had hoped I didn't know the law. She had hoped I would be too distraught to react. She thought this funeral was her stage and that I would be too broken to push back. Then Ruth stepped forward, silent as a shadow, and handed the church's officiant a copy of the divorce decree, stamped, sealed, notarized. Full waiver of future claim to assets, finalized over a decade ago. I didn't need to say anything else. The truth was in ink, and the hush that followed was louder than any shouting could have been. Someone coughed. Someone else muttered, "Lord help us." Veronica stood still, lips tight, eyes darting across the pews. She was waiting for someone to speak up for her. No one did. And I stood there, not triumphant, not smug, just steady. I had spent 15 years raising my son alone after she left him with nothing but medical debt and heartbreak. I had been there for every radiation appointment, every surgery, every late-night call when the pain came faster than the meds could keep up. She had been gone, vanished, until the money made it worth coming back. So when I finally turned to leave the chapel, I didn't look back at her. I walked toward the exit with Ruth beside me, our steps slow and even. I heard someone whisper my name with sympathy. Another said justice. But I didn't need sympathy. I didn't want justice. Not yet. Because I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. And if you think that was the end of it, you might want to stay with me. The next few hours? They were only the beginning. And what came next made the funeral look like a warm-up. We didn't leave the chapel in silence. Behind me, I could hear murmurs, swelling into low conversations, chairs shifting, the creak of wooden pews as people stood to follow. Veronica's voice, sharp and trembling now, followed me out the door like the echo of something broken. But I didn't slow down. Outside, the wind had picked up. Ruth caught up with me at the edge of the stone steps and handed me a manila envelope without a word. I tucked it under my arm. We both knew it would be needed soon. The funeral director, flustered, met us at the curb to apologize for the disruption. I told him not to worry. Death doesn't always bring dignity. He didn't know what to say after that, and I didn't need him to. We got in the car. Ruth drove. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, hands folded, breathing slow. Not calm, just controlled. There's a difference. It took exactly 11 minutes to get to the downtown office of Calder and Associates. Ruth's assistant had already cleared the conference room. She slid the door closed behind us and locked it. Then Ruth placed 2 documents on the table and smoothed them out. The first was the updated last will and testament of my son, dated 9 months before he passed. I had sat beside him when he signed it, his hands thin but steady. In it, he left every asset he had to me: the money, the company stock, the property, the insurance payout, even the intellectual rights to the app he had designed in the final months of his life. There was no mention of Veronica, not a single line. The second document was the divorce settlement from 15 years ago, a full waiver of future rights to any assets, current or forthcoming. Finalized and notarized. Ruth had the certified copy in hand, along with the county filing record. No loopholes, no ambiguity. Still, Ruth's voice was measured. Veronica has nothing to stand on. But she's bold. I expect she will escalate. I nodded. My jaw was clenched, not in fear, but in focus. If Veronica wanted to turn this into a war, I would meet her at the front lines. I had mourned my son with every part of me. Now I would defend what he left behind. I would not let a woman who vanished for 15 years twist the final chapter of his life into a legal circus. Ruth handed me a copy of the estate inventory, neatly listed in categories. I glanced through it. Bank holdings, company shares, the lake house, the condo, even the car. Then I saw the last item, a private video letter, recorded by my son and stored digitally under attorney-client protection. I hadn't known he had done that. Ruth tapped the folder. It's time. We drove to the courthouse, not for a hearing, not yet, but for a meeting Ruth had arranged with the officiating judge on emergency probate procedures. A courtesy, given the size of the estate and the obvious tension surrounding it. He agreed to review the files early and confirm that Veronica's claims would be flagged as invalid upon immediate filing. A temporary protection order over the estate was issued within the hour. Back outside, the sky had darkened, clouds folding in like a curtain drawn before a storm. Veronica's lawyer called Ruth while we were on the steps. Ruth answered on speaker. His voice cracked as he asked for a meeting to discuss possible joint resolution. Ruth replied that all conversations needed to be in writing and that Veronica's interference at a religious service would be included in any formal response. I didn't speak during the call. I didn't need to. I had spent years being silent for the sake of peace, for my son, for family. That time had ended the moment Veronica said $24 million in front of his coffin. That evening, back home, I opened the private video letter. He was sitting in the chair by the window, the one we used to read next to when he was a boy. His voice was calm, his tone clear. He spoke about the foundation and he wanted me to build. The community scholarships, the memorial garden behind the tech lab. He spoke about me, about the way I had stood by him, about the strength he hoped I would keep showing even after he was gone. Then, near the end, he said something I will never forget. If she comes back, I need you to stand your ground, not just for me, for yourself. She walked away from me. But you, Mum, you never did. You deserve everything I left you. I chose you. I played that last part twice. And then I sat in silence, with the weight of those words on my chest, like a hand pressing firmly but gently. I didn't cry, not that night. There would be time for that later. Right now, I had a decision to make. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a notepad. I wrote down 3 names. 3 people who had stood by my son when Veronica didn't. 3 people who had witnessed things, known things. One of them had access to hospital records. Another had archived the development contracts. The third had personal emails that were never released. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protection. I would not let her rewrite his story. Not while I had breath in my lungs. Not while I still had his voice in my ears. It had begun at the funeral. But by morning, this would become something else entirely. By the next morning, word had spread. Not about the money. That would come later. But about what happened in the church. About Veronica's entrance. About the confrontation. About the silence that followed. My phone rang before sunrise. Old neighbors, distant cousins, people I hadn't heard from in years, calling to ask how I was holding up. But underneath the concern, I could hear something else. Curiosity, hesitation, a faint, questioning tone in their voice, like they weren't sure what side of the story they believed yet. I didn't return the calls. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and watched the sky lighten over the backyard. The same yard where my son had played when he was small, where we had grilled burgers on weekends, where I had planted forget-me-nots along the fence line during his first round of chemotherapy. It was a quiet space, a good place to think. But the quiet didn't last. Around 10 that morning, Veronica posted a photo, a cropped picture of my son from years ago, one she had no business sharing. Her caption was short. Heartbroken to say goodbye to the love of my life. May justice be served. Then came the comments. Most were from people who didn't know better, or didn't care to, people who took her version of the story and ran with it. There were sympathy emojis, words like brave and unfair and tragic. A few mentioned lawyers. One said she should fight for what was hers. That was the moment it changed. I had already expected a legal fight. I had already secured the documents. But this was something different. This was public. This was image. And if I had learned anything over the past decade, it was that people believe what they see first, even if it's a lie. I texted Ruth. Her reply came fast. Already monitoring. We're preparing a timeline for release. Within the hour, my son's CFO, Priya, called to say she had received 2 calls from journalists asking about the widow. Priya said that word with a tight bitterness I appreciated. I told her to sit tight. We weren't going to react. We were going to respond. And there's a difference. At noon, I drove downtown to meet Ruth. She had booked a quiet room in a private library that used to be a bank. Thick walls, soundproof. We didn't want ears. What we had to prepare wasn't just legal anymore. It was reputational. Ruth laid out the plan. 3 parts. First, confirm the legal standing with the judge's temporary order and begin process for a permanent motion to block Veronica's interference. That part was already in motion. Second, gather all personal evidence my son left behind and all documentation from people in his inner circle. Priya had emails and schedules. Miguel had notarized records of the divorce and property settlements. Daniel, the ICU nurse, had a written statement about the final week, including the visit Veronica never made. Third, prepare for the event. That was the part Ruth hadn't told me yet. She wanted to hold a public dedication, not just a press release or a legal filing, but something real, something visible, a public commitment to the foundation my son had wanted to create. Ruth believed that the best defense wasn't just a courtroom, it was a crowd, and she wasn't wrong. We chose a date, 3 days from now. Location, the main conference room at City Hall. The mayor had already expressed support for the foundation months earlier, when my son was still alive and quietly laying the groundwork. We still had the letters, the permits, everything he had arranged. We were simply continuing what he started. But I wasn't interested in staging a spectacle. I told Ruth this had to remain centered on him, not her, not me. The cause, the mission, the community impact. That's what mattered. Still, I knew Veronica would come, and I needed to be ready. That evening, I visited the old tech office where my son used to work. The lights were dimmed now, the furniture covered. The staff had moved on after the acquisition, but Priya still had the keys. She met me at the front and walked me to his old desk. His chair was still there. So was the mug with the chip on the handle. The whiteboard with half-faded notes about app functionality. His handwriting. Priya handed me a flash drive. She didn't say much, just pressed it into my palm and nodded. Inside were the last 2 months of my son's private emails. She had filtered out anything irrelevant. What remained were communications about the foundation, his final medical instructions, and his last known contacts with legal advisors. Later that night, I sat at my own desk, the same one where I used to grade papers when I taught 2nd grade, and I opened the drive. There were 3 emails flagged with red stars. 1 to Ruth, 1 to Priya, 1 to me. The one to me was never sent. He had saved it as a draft. It said, "Mum, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if she shows up, I know it'll be hard. But I need you to remember, you are the only one who stayed. You were there when I couldn't walk, when I couldn't sleep, when I was more tubes than skin. You never once left the room. So don't let her rewrite what you and I both lived. I chose you, not her, never her." That was the moment my doubt vanished. Not that I had planned to step aside, but something inside me settled. I had carried pain and fury all week. Now I had clarity. She wanted to weaponize public opinion. I would hold up the truth. Not just in court, but in front of every person who had seen her post and believed her lie. 3 days. I would stand in that room, and the story would be his, not hers, not mine. His, all the way through. 3 days after the funeral, I walked into City Hall through the back entrance. Ruth had arranged it that way. Less noise, fewer eyes. The auditorium was already filling with people. Local press, tech investors, community leaders. The mayor's office had confirmed attendance, not to make a speech, but to show support. That mattered more. The event was simple on paper. A dedication, the public launch of the Holbrook Memorial Foundation. But we all knew it was more than that. It was a message. The chairs were arranged in rows, facing a projection screen. A banner hung near the front. A legacy of purpose. My son's face was on the program, smiling in that quiet way he always had when he was proud but didn't want attention. That smile would speak for him now. Ruth and Priya handled the press check-in. Miguel was stationed by the side table with legal binders. Daniel, the nurse, had volunteered to help escort elderly guests. Everyone had a role. Everyone understood the stakes. At 10:02 a.m., the doors closed. At 10:05, Ruth stepped up to the podium and tapped the mic once. She didn't smile. She wasn't here to charm anyone. Good morning. We are here to honor the vision and values of a man who lived with quiet brilliance and left behind a plan for impact. What you will see today is not about loss. It is about intention, about clarity, about truth. She stepped aside, and the lights dimmed. The screen lit up with a video. It was dated 5 weeks before his death. My son sat in a chair, shoulders a bit slouched, eyes tired but focused. The background was his home office, the one filled with books and plants and pictures I knew by heart. His voice came through steady. If you are watching this, then I'm not around anymore. But I wanted to explain, in my own words, why I made the choices I did. I didn't want confusion. I didn't want arguments. I wanted the truth to speak for itself. He went on to describe his illness, his hopes for the foundation, his decision to leave his assets to me, and only me, his reasons, not emotional, not vengeful, just measured. She left, he said plainly. When I needed her most, she was gone. And when I built something worth returning for, she came back. I cannot allow that to define my legacy. I am choosing the person who never left. The room was silent when the video ended. No coughing, no fidgeting, just stillness. I stood, not because I wanted to, because I had to. I walked slowly to the podium. I had spoken in classrooms for 30 years. I had given eulogies and birthday toasts and retirement speeches. But this moment was different. This was not about celebration. This was about line drawing. I thanked everyone for being there. I acknowledged the mayor's presence. Then I read the names of the first scholarship recipients. I read the names of local schools receiving STEM grants. I outlined the emergency medical relief fund that would carry my son's name. The audience listened closely. No one interrupted. Then I addressed the situation directly. Some of you may have seen posts online, heard rumors, read comments. I will not respond to gossip. I will respond with evidence. Priya dimmed the lights again. The screen showed emails from my son, labeled, dated, verified, communications with Ruth, with Priya, with me. They documented his intentions, his revised estate plans, his cancelled insurance beneficiary designations. Everything, the foundation of facts. Next came scanned legal documents, the divorce decree, the settlement agreement, the waiver of rights. Highlighted in yellow, the line where Veronica had signed her full consent to relinquish any future claims. Then, the last slide. A screenshot of an email Veronica had sent to a close friend 6 weeks before the funeral. The message had been forwarded anonymously to Ruth's office. In it, Veronica wrote, "I don't care what it takes. I'm going back to get what should have been mine. He owed me, and if his mother wants a war, I'm ready. I looked at the audience. That was her story. This is mine. And this foundation, this work, this legacy belongs to the man who earned it, not the one who left him, not the one who came back when the headlines did. A few people clapped, then a few more. By the time I stepped back from the podium, it was a full room of applause. I didn't smile. I didn't bow. I just nodded once and returned to my seat. Veronica was there. I had seen her arrive late. She sat in the back row, sunglasses on, lips tight. When the lights came back on, she stood and left. She didn't make a scene. She didn't speak. But her heels clicked loud against the floor as she exited, like she wanted to be heard, like she wanted someone to chase her. No one did. Ruth leaned toward me. She's going to retaliate. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. She would try, and we would be ready. After the event ended, people came up to me, shook my hand, told me stories about my son, stories I hadn't heard before. A classmate from college, a mentee from a tech incubator, a father whose child had received free tutoring from the app my son had built in his final year. That afternoon, a photo from the event hit the news. Me standing at the podium, one hand on the lectern, the other holding the program. My son's face beside me on the screen. The caption read, "A mother protects her son's legacy." And that's exactly what I had done. Publicly, clearly, without shouting, without rage, but with every fact sharpened like a blade. It wasn't revenge, not yet. But it was the beginning. The next morning, I woke to silence. No new texts, no missed calls, no emails from Ruth. But I didn't mistake the stillness for peace. It was the kind of silence that comes before something breaks. At 8:30, Ruth sent me a single message. Stay off social media. Her tone was always controlled, but I could feel the urgency behind those 4 words. I obeyed, but I didn't have to wonder long. Priya called 30 minutes later. She didn't waste time. Veronica posted something. Video clip. Spliced edits of your son. Out of context. Makes it sound like he regretted changing the will. She added her own voiceover. I closed my eyes and took a long breath. The event at City Hall had shaken her. Now she was fighting dirty. That afternoon, Ruth and I met again in the same private room at the old bank building. She had already downloaded the clip, backed it up, transcribed it, and had a team verifying its edits. There was no full footage to match, no record of those words in any raw files. It was fabrication, but it was subtle enough to fool people who wanted to believe her. Ruth turned the laptop screen toward me and pressed play. My son's voice came through, but the sentences were clipped, phrases rearranged, pauses removed. He sounded unsure, weighed down. Then Veronica's voice layered in. She spoke gently, sympathetically, but every word implied that I had manipulated my son into excluding her. She had even titled the video, "Let the Truth Be Heard." It was already being shared. Comments turned fast. Strangers called her brave. Others called me greedy. A few suggested I had isolated my son during his illness, pushed away his friends, cut off his former wife out of jealousy. Lies grow fast in the right soil. But we didn't panic. Ruth already had the next move planned. The first part was simple. We would release the full video in question, the untouched version, time-stamped, recorded in a single take. Miguel had the original on a secure drive. The second part took more coordination. By evening, Priya had secured permission from 3 of my son's former business partners to share internal communications, archived emails, meeting notes, Messages from my son expressing disappointment in Veronica's behavior. In one message, dated 2 years before his death, he wrote, "She reached out again, not to ask about my health, not to apologize, just to find out if the IPO went through. I'm tired of pretending people care when they don't. I don't have the energy anymore." Ruth gathered these into a packet labeled Behavioral Pattern Documentation. Clean, professional, devastating. The next morning, we held a press briefing. Not a flashy one, no podium, just a conference room with a projector and printed packets for every person in the room. Ruth opened with a single sentence. "Misinformation is dangerous. Here is the truth." Then we played the full original video, my son's unedited message, calm, clear, confident. He explained his decisions without hesitation, without confusion. He named me as his sole executor, his only caregiver, his only remaining family. We distributed the written evidence. We allowed time for questions. We gave no sound bites, no spin, just facts. Veronica didn't respond publicly, but she didn't need to. The damage was already visible. That night, one of the community blogs that had praised her earlier issued a quiet retraction. Another pulled down her video. A third posted side-by-side transcripts showing how the clip had been manipulated. Still, it wasn't enough. Not for me. The facts were on my side, but I wasn't chasing facts. I was chasing clarity. So I made a decision. I called Priya and asked her to release the internal memo my son had written during his final hospital stay. It had been meant for the company's board, but it was personal in tone. It detailed his plan for the foundation, his reasons for creating it in my name, his desire to distance the organization from anyone who had abandoned him. At the end of the memo, he wrote, "I don't want my name used for anything fake, anything shallow. If people are going to remember me, let it be for what I actually did, and who actually stood by me." Ruth hesitated before agreeing. It was a powerful piece. It would land hard, but it would also stir things up again. I told her that was the point. It went live at noon, published with consent from the board and endorsed by the foundation. It didn't attack Veronica. It didn't mention her by name, but it exposed every lie she had told, just by existing. By evening, I began receiving messages. Strangers, survivors, caregivers, people who had watched loved ones die slowly and alone. They wrote to say they understood. They believed me. They had seen people show up too late, just to claim something they hadn't earned. But even that didn't satisfy me. Not fully. Because Veronica wasn't done. At 10:30 that night, Ruth called me again. She's filed a motion to contest the will. Claims your son was coerced. Claims he lacked full mental capacity when he made the final changes. I asked Ruth how strong the claim was. She said weak, but it would force a response. It would trigger discovery. It would open records. I told her I wasn't afraid of records. Let her dig. Because the deeper she went, the more she would uncover the truth she was trying to bury. This wasn't just about a lie anymore. This was about character. And character has a longer reach than money. She wanted war. I had warned her. And now she had it. On paper. On record. In front of everyone. The filing came in late on a Thursday. Ruth forwarded me the motion at 9:42 p.m., exactly the way I knew she would. Clean, annotated, with a short note at the bottom. "You do not need to respond yet. But you should see this. I read every page." Veronica's legal team had accused me of undue influence. They claimed my son had been emotionally manipulated, that I had isolated him, that I had coerced him into rewriting the will when his mind was clouded by medication and illness. They called me controlling, overbearing, ruthless. I sat alone at the kitchen table, The same table where I used to lay out science projects and spelling flashcards. The same table where I had once shaved my son's head after his first round of chemo, trying to make him laugh as the hair came out in clumps. Now that table held an accusation that I had stolen from him, bent him to my will, used his pain to my benefit. I let myself feel it. Not the anger, not yet. The grief. It settled in my chest like something old returning, something with weight, something I thought I had already made peace with. But it came back that night, because to read that motion was to relive every hour I had sat beside him. Every time I had held a vomit bag in one hand and his fingers in the other. Every time I had pressed the morphine button when the nurse didn't come fast enough. They called me ruthless. But they weren't there when I read to him through the nausea, when I changed his sheets at 3 in the morning, when I massaged his feet so he could sleep. They weren't there the night he woke up screaming and couldn't remember what year it was. They weren't there the afternoon he asked me, clearly and with full breath, to make sure she never got a penny. I was. So I let the weight sit. I didn't fight it. I didn't push it away. I poured myself a glass of water. I sat still. I let the words wash over me, and I remembered exactly who I was. Not the woman they described on paper, but the mother who stayed. The next morning, I met Ruth at her office. She had already drafted our initial response. But before we filed anything, we sat in silence for a while. She looked at me like she was waiting for me to crack, or to rage, or to break down. I didn't. I just said, "Let's make it clean. Let's make it final." She nodded. We agreed to prepare the affidavits. Daniel's testimony as the nurse, Priya's statement as CFO, Miguel's notarized logs. We would include the full email chain that documented my son's requests, his voice recording, his private memo, everything. But I didn't want the next step to be only legal. I needed something more. I told Ruth I wanted to write a letter, not for court, for the foundation, for the community. She hesitated but agreed. That weekend, I sat down with a pen and wrote in longhand. I kept it simple. I am not my son's voice, but I am the echo of what he believed. He believed in fairness, in decency, in truth that did not need to shout to be heard. He built what he built not for fame or legacy, but because he wanted to solve a problem, to leave something useful behind. I stayed by his side. I did not do it for reward. I did not do it for recognition. I did it because I loved him, and because I believe in what he wanted this foundation to be. The next week, Ruth filed the full rebuttal. It was longer than the original motion, more thorough, heavier with documentation. Then we waited. During that time, Veronica did what I expected. She went to the press, gave interviews, played the role. She spoke about love and memory and heartbreak. She shared carefully cropped photos. She cried on cue. But something had shifted. The public wasn't so sure anymore. Some articles began using the word alleged. Some commenters began referencing the full video, the emails, the contradiction between what she said and what the documents showed. Truth doesn't always move fast, but it moves steady. Ruth told me it could take weeks for the judge to review the motion. She warned me that Veronica might push for a hearing, might try to delay things, might try to drain us with time. I told her I wasn't worried, because I had already waited through worse. I had waited through blood tests and scan results and the sound of machines beeping in the middle of the night. Waiting for court dates and paper reviews didn't scare me. Not like watching your child fade by inches. During those days, I stayed busy. I spent mornings at the foundation office, reviewing grant proposals, meeting with the new director, setting up scholarship panels. I made sure the work moved forward. I kept my hands busy so my heart would not stay clenched. One afternoon, while I was reviewing budget reports, a volunteer walked in with a letter. It was handwritten. No return address. Inside was a simple message. You are not alone. I believe you. I watched my sister get taken apart by someone like her. Thank you for speaking up. There was no signature, just those few lines. But it reminded me that what we were doing was not only about property or inheritance. It was about setting the story right, not with fire, but with focus, not with volume, but with proof. That was what she never understood. She thought power came from noise. But I had learned that power, real power, comes from consistency. And I would be consistent, all the way through. The ruling came on a Wednesday morning. It was quiet, not televised, no camera crews, no headlines screaming justice or fraud. Just a notification from Ruth that the court had issued its decision. She had forwarded the official copy to my inbox. 212 pages. I read every one. The motion to contest the will was dismissed in full. No trial, no hearing. The judge had found the evidence clear. My son had been of sound mind. He had made his decisions deliberately. There was no sign of coercion, no manipulation, no external pressure. Veronica's claims were described as unfounded, speculative, and in several instances, intentionally misleading. That last phrase mattered most. Intentionally misleading. In court language, that meant more than just losing. It meant exposure. It meant vulnerability. It meant consequences. The next step moved faster than even Ruth expected. Within 48 hours, the court ordered a hearing to review potential sanctions against Veronica's legal team. Misuse of process, abuse of system, attempting to mislead a probate court with altered materials. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. I didn't plan to attend at first. I had told myself the dismissal was enough, that I didn't need to see the fallout, that I had what I came for. My son's wishes protected, his legacy intact. But 2 days before the hearing, Ruth called. She said Veronica had submitted a last-minute request. She wanted the hearing closed to the public, claimed emotional distress, claimed it would harm her reputation, claimed it would interfere with her ability to seek work and rebuild her life. The judge denied her request. That's when I decided I would be there. I arrived early, sat in the back row. The room was small, no media, just the parties, their lawyers, and a few court staff. Ruth sat beside me, her posture relaxed but alert. Veronica entered 5 minutes before the start, dressed in a navy suit that was too polished for the setting. Her hair was pulled back. Her eyes didn't scan the room. She knew I was there, but she didn't look at me. The judge entered. The hearing began. No drama, no theatrics, just a slow, methodical breakdown of what had happened. They reviewed the motion Veronica had filed, the video she had posted, the way it had been edited, the affidavits that contradicted her version of events, the financial records, the legal history, her pattern of communication with people close to my son, the timing of her appearance, her social media statements before and after the funeral. They pulled it all apart, piece by piece, thread by thread. And when they were done, it was bare. No support, no defense, no ground left to stand on. Her lawyer attempted to argue that she had been misled, that she hadn't fully understood the risks, that she had acted out of grief. But the judge stopped him. The grief of losing a man you abandoned does not excuse the manipulation of this court. His words, not Ruth's, not mine. The judge then turned his attention to her lawyer's conduct. He asked about the origin of the edited video, about the decision to file the motion without disclosing the full estate documentation, about the statements made to the media that implied there was a pending investigation into me. No answers satisfied him. By the end of the hearing, it was clear. Sanctions were recommended. Veronica's lawyer would face formal review from the state bar. Veronica herself would be required to pay legal fees associated with the response to her motion. The amount was steep. The court issued a freeze on her accounts, pending collection. It wasn't jail. It wasn't scandal. But it was the legal version of a reckoning. I watched her face as the judge read the decision aloud. Her expression didn't change. Not once. But her hands moved, tightening, untightening, one after the other. When the judge adjourned the hearing, Ruth and I stood. We didn't approach. We didn't linger. But as we walked toward the exit, Veronica turned just slightly, not enough to make eye contact, but enough for me to see the hollow look in her eyes. She had walked into this, thinking she could bend reality. She left with her name in court records, her finances locked, her story shredded. That afternoon, Ruth sent out a statement to the Foundation's press contacts. Brief, professional. The Holbrook Foundation respects the court's findings and remains committed to carrying forward the mission defined by its founder. We consider this matter resolved. No triumph, no spike in tone, just finality. I sat in my garden that evening, alone, the same bench where my son once sat after his first clean scan, and I breathed in the quiet. Not peace, not yet, but quiet. The kind that comes after a door has been shut. The kind that says you made it through something, and nothing needs to be said anymore. The following week, I received a letter, handwritten, no return address, just my name on the front. No one sends handwritten letters anymore, but I knew before I opened it who it was from. It wasn't a confession or an apology. It wasn't even a threat. It was a request. One line. I need 5 minutes, just to say one thing in person. I set the letter aside. Let it sit on my nightstand for 2 days. I didn't show it to Ruth. I didn't call anyone. And then, one afternoon, I called the number she scribbled at the bottom. I told her to meet me at the public greenhouse on Sycamore Street. Midday, neutral ground, no cameras, no eyes. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting at a bench near the orchid section. That felt almost deliberate. Orchids don't beg for attention. They sit quietly and command it. I approached slowly, sat down beside her. There was space between us. Not a word passed between us for nearly a full minute. Then she spoke, not with an apology, not even a soft tone. Her voice was clipped, measured, but not cold. She said she was angry, angry that she had been written out of her own history, that the world remembered her only as the woman who left, that my son had moved on without her and found meaning elsewhere. She said she had thought that maybe, just maybe, she could reclaim a piece of that story by stepping back in when he was gone. Not for money, she said, but for relevance, for image, for the right to not be forgotten. I didn't interrupt. I let her speak. Then I looked at her, and I told her the truth, that being forgotten was not a punishment. It was a consequence. You disappear from people's lives when you choose to disappear from their pain. My son had spent the better part of a decade healing from what she left him with. His dignity wasn't a prize. It was earned, with grit, with nights full of silence, with friendships forged from scratch, with a kind of quiet strength that never made the papers. I reminded her that legacy isn't built through drama, it's built through presence, through staying, through showing up when there is nothing to gain. She looked away. Her jaw was tight. Her fingers clenched the edge of the bench. Then she said she had no plan left. that the court orders had wiped out what little she had, that she wasn't here to ask for help, but she didn't know what came next. I believed her, not because I trusted her, but because desperation has a sound, and I had lived through enough to recognize it. I didn't offer her comfort, but I didn't add cruelty either. I stood, told her to take care of herself, told her this would be the last time we spoke, that if she ever approached the foundation, the board, or my family again, I would respond with the full force of law. Her mouth opened slightly like she wanted to protest, but she didn't. She just nodded once, slow and almost imperceptible. I walked away, past the orchids, past the glass windows streaked with spring sunlight, and I didn't look back. Later that evening, I sat at my dining table, a cup of tea, a folder of foundation documents, and a photograph. One I hadn't looked at in a long time. It was my son, taken the year before he died, standing outside a small elementary school in rural Kansas, where he had funded a literacy center through the foundation. He wasn't smiling, but there was something solid in his posture, a calm certainty in the way he stood, surrounded by children who didn't yet know the weight he carried. I studied that photograph, and for the first time in a while, I didn't feel the ache of grief. I felt something else, a kind of gratitude, that he had been able to build something that couldn't be stolen, edited, or twisted. A legacy that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with choice. I leaned back in my chair, closed the folder. The house was quiet, but not the same kind of quiet as before. Not the hollow kind. This was different. There were still battles ahead, legal filings, press inquiries, trustees to train. But this moment, this stillness, was mine. The woman who walked into that greenhouse had been chasing shadows, a version of herself that never existed, a place in a story she abandoned. But I wasn't chasing anything. I had stopped running a long time ago. And now, I had the clarity of someone who no longer owed silence to anyone. The auditorium was packed. It wasn't the kind of place I thought I'd find myself again at 71, not since my son's memorial 2 years back. But this time, the lights were brighter, the cameras sharper, and the silence thicker than before. It was the official launch of the Community Library Initiative, built with the first wave of funding from the foundation in my son's name. A project Veronica had tried, unsuccessfully, to put her name on in recent weeks, by sending letters to sponsors and even attempting to rebrand the initiative through her own fabricated press release. I let her try. I watched quietly as her delusions stacked up. Emails sent to the mayor's office, interviews requested with local media under false credentials. She had tried to position herself as the visionary behind a movement she had no part in. But today would be the day that narrative ended, publicly, with no way for her to edit or erase what came next. The mayor opened the event with some expected notes about education and equity. The head of the foundation said a few words. And then, the microphone was mine. I stood slowly. My knees reminded me I wasn't 20 anymore. But my back was straight, and my voice didn't waver. I started by naming my son, not as a victim, not as a tragedy, but as a man who built bridges where others had burned them. I spoke of his commitment to education, of his quiet investment in underserved schools, of his belief that books could give children a language for dreams they hadn't yet learned to name. Then I paused. I turned slightly toward the left side of the room. She was there. Veronica. In the third row, wearing a dark blazer and the same expression she always wore when she thought she still had leverage. Tight lips, alert eyes, controlled breath. I didn't look away. I said the next words slowly, with precision. That legacy is not a costume you can put on when convenient, that it is not for sale, and it cannot be stolen. That the foundation had been approached by individuals claiming ties they never earned, attempting to leverage grief into personal gain. That these individuals were now permanently barred, by court order, from any contact with the foundation, its assets, or its representatives. And finally, that the library and all future projects would move forward under a new name, not just my son's, but the name of the children he taught, the communities he served, the ones who had shown up when others had vanished. The room stayed silent. There were no gasps, no applause, just a thick awareness that something irreversible had just occurred. I stepped down, my cane tapping lightly against the floor as I walked back to my seat. I didn't look at her again, but I felt it. The shift, the unraveling. She didn't move for a long time, just sat there, frozen, as the event moved on around her. Afterward, several board members came to thank me. The mayor shook my hand. Reporters asked for a quote, which I declined. My job was done. But the real weight of that moment didn't settle until I returned home and found the message waiting. It was from one of the foundation's attorneys. She had received a desperate email from Veronica's attorney the hours after the event, demanding reconsideration, claiming the statements had defamed her. Attached to it were images of a cease and desist letter she had tried to issue. Weak, empty. The attorney assured me we had nothing to worry about. Everything had been reviewed, approved, legally fireproof. But it wasn't the legal shield that mattered to me. It was the silence. Because for the first time since my son's funeral, Veronica had no more tools left to twist the story. Her name had been wiped from every narrative she tried to enter, not by revenge, but by truth. Later that night, Ruth dropped by. She had attended the event too, sitting quietly in the back. She didn't say much, just poured tea, sat across from me. Then she said, "That was the most quiet fury I've ever witnessed." I nodded. That's all it needed to be. Not a spectacle, not a shouting match, just a mirror. Held up long enough that the reflection couldn't be denied. And in that reflection, she saw what she truly was. A footnote in someone else's life, one she had long ago abandoned. The storm had passed, but I wasn't left shattered. I was still standing, firm and free. And now the only name etched in stone wasn't hers. It was his. The fallout came quickly, faster than even I had anticipated. It started with the grant revocations. 2 major education nonprofits withdrew their pending collaboration with Veronica's so-called mentorship program. They released statements, tactful but clear, noting inconsistencies in her claimed experience and issues with transparency in fund allocation. By midweek, local donors had quietly backed out too. The emails came pouring into the foundation office. Parents who once believed Veronica had been close to my son now demanded explanations for the letters they had received months ago. Letters where she had claimed to be relaunching a private school project he supposedly started. A project that had never existed. But it wasn't until the fraud investigation began that the ground beneath her finally split open. One of the board members of the new community library initiative had a daughter who worked in state-level auditing. She saw the footage of my speech. She made a few calls. What followed was a quiet but thorough comb-through of Veronica's filings, taxes, and property records. It didn't take long to find the gaps. Unreported income, invoices sent to shell non-profits that redirected funds to a personal account under her cousin's name, a 2-year trail of ghost donors and cash events with no itemized expense logs. It escalated from suspicion to subpoena, and Veronica knew it. I didn't gloat. I didn't send her letters or make any calls. I didn't need to. But I did read the report when it reached me. 17 pages long, listing every maneuver she had tried to make behind the scenes. Every lie, every forged affiliation, every time she had pretended to be acting on behalf of my late son, just to siphon off sympathy or cash. She was stripped of her rights to operate any non-profit entity in the state, fined heavily, her personal accounts frozen pending investigation, her passport revoked, and the real weight came with the public filing. Her name, her misdeeds, her fabricated legacy, all printed plainly on official state documents. By the second week, the news had hit the local press. Her name trended on social media, but not with support. It wasn't outrage either. It was silence. No one came to her defense, even her own daughter, my granddaughter-in-law, a quiet girl named Camille, who had stayed out of the feud, released a brief statement online, clarifying that she had been estranged from her mother for years and had no involvement in any of her actions. It broke whatever remained of the illusion Veronica had wrapped herself in. She wasn't the widow of a fallen hero. She was just a woman who left a marriage, abandoned a child, and returned only when money reappeared. One morning, Ruth handed me an envelope. No return address, inside a photo, crumpled, old. It was of my son, maybe 6 or 7, a school play. Veronica was in the background, barely visible, but it was enough to see she had once stood near him, at least once, long before everything crumbled. Underneath it, a note, handwritten. I didn't read it at first. I kept it on the counter for 2 days, untouched. Then quietly I opened it. It was not an apology. It was a plea, a single sentence. "You've taken everything. I have nowhere left to go." I folded it back, placed it beneath the picture, and tucked both into the back of a drawer I rarely opened. There was no satisfaction in her collapse, no joy in her isolation. But there was clarity. A person who builds her life on lies cannot blame others when the truth knocks everything down. Later that week, I received a call from the city office. They wanted to offer me a place on the advisory council for senior outreach programs. A part-time position focused on helping older women navigate financial decisions, legal protection, and family conflicts. Apparently, my story had quietly reached more ears than I realized. I accepted. Not for visibility, but for continuity. Because when I sat across from those women, those quiet faces with tired eyes and gentle hands, I saw versions of myself. Version that still wondered if silence was the safest route, if forgiveness meant erasing the offense, if dignity was something they had to trade away in exchange for peace. And I told them simply that clarity is not cruelty, that boundaries are not betrayal, that speaking the truth does not make you hard, it makes you whole. I never mentioned Veronica's name. She had become irrelevant to the work, not forgotten, but no longer the shadow standing in my doorway. At the end of that week, I walked past the old cemetery where my son's name had been etched into the memorial wall, and for the first time, I sat on the bench beside it, not in mourning, but in restoration. The sun was low, casting long golden lines across the ground. I leaned back, closed my eyes, breathed. There was no vengeance in my chest, no fire left in my throat. Only space, quiet, sacred space. And I knew that whatever came next, it would begin from here. I didn't expect to see her again, but life, in all its twisted symmetry, had other plans. It was a Thursday afternoon in early spring when I saw her outside the courthouse. Veronica. She was standing on the far side of the sidewalk, just past the bench near the parking lot. Her coat was too thin for the wind. Her hair pulled back in a loose, uneven twist. No makeup, no mask, just her face. tired, raw. I had just finished giving a short presentation at the community safety panel, outlining new resources for older citizens at risk of financial abuse. On my way out, I stopped by to drop off paperwork for the new outreach initiative. The timing, it seemed, had been orchestrated by some invisible force. Our eyes locked. She didn't move. Neither did I. There was no crowd, no cameras, just two women on opposite ends of a story that had unraveled far too long. She walked toward me slowly, hesitant steps, like she didn't know if her legs would carry her all the way. Or maybe she was hoping they wouldn't. When she finally stood in front of me, she didn't speak, just looked at me. Not with fury, not with apology, just a quiet, hollow kind of ache. "I'm not here for a second chance," she said eventually. I waited. "I just wanted to look you in the eye, one last time." I nodded. She paused, glanced at the building behind me, then back at my face. "I thought I was owed something," she said, softer now. "For what I lost, for the life I didn't get." Her voice trembled, not out of drama, but because there was nothing left to grip. "I told myself you were cruel," she continued, "that you were trying to erase me from his story. But maybe you weren't. Maybe I was never really part of it." Silence stretched between us. She didn't cry. I didn't speak. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded letter. Not sealed. She held it out. "I wrote this for you a while ago," she said. "I never sent it." I didn't take it. "I don't need your letter," I said plainly. She dropped her arm, let the paper fall to the ground between us. And that was that. No tears, no dramatic exit. She turned and walked back across the sidewalk, into the blur of people who didn't know her, didn't care, wouldn't look twice. And I let her go. There was no weight in my chest, no surge of satisfaction, just stillness. Closure, I've learned, doesn't always come with final words or grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in the form of no longer needing an apology, no longer needing to prove anything. That night, I sat on my back porch. The sky was a soft lavender hue, fading into dusk. Ruth brought me tea, and we sat in quiet for a while. I told her about the encounter, just the facts, no embellishments. She didn't ask for more. Instead, she said something I'll never forget. "You didn't break her. You revealed her." And it was true. Veronica had crafted her downfall with every lie she thought would never catch up to her. I had simply refused to play the role she had written for me. Later that week, the last batch of letters from the foundation arrived. Some were handwritten, others typed. Messages from women across the country who had heard my story, through the community bulletin, through quiet circles of conversation, through whispers passed between neighbors. They didn't ask for money. They didn't ask for advice. They simply shared stories of betrayal, of stolen pensions, of children who took and took until there was nothing left. But woven through their grief was something else. Resolve, a quiet, flickering determination to draw lines, to reclaim space, to speak, even if their voices trembled. I answered every letter, sometimes with just a sentence, sometimes with pages. I didn't preach, I didn't console, I simply acknowledged them. And in that exchange, something shifted. This wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't even about Veronica. It was about the quiet war too many women had fought behind closed doors, believing they were alone. They weren't. I wasn't. And somehow that was enough. That was the real justice, not just the headlines or court filings, but the ripple effect, the quiet revolution happening one conversation at a time. By the end of the week, I filed the last of the grant approvals. signed off the final forms for the spring workshop series, set aside the voice recorder for next month's testimonial interviews. I didn't look back, not because I was running, but because I was finally walking forward, without weight, without war, just with the knowledge that I had told the truth and survived it. The next spring, I planted roses, not the delicate kind that curl in on themselves after a single gust of wind, but the thick-stemmed climbing ones, meant to hold their own through sun and storm. I chose a deep crimson for one side of the porch, and a pale ivory for the other. The balance pleased me. Fire and grace, strength and peace, I needed both. By then the house was quiet again, not empty, just quiet in the right way, the kind of quiet you earn after a long, messy life. Ruth had gone back to teaching part-time, and I'd settled into my weekly meetings with the community board, mentoring younger women who had found themselves caught in similar storms. I didn't tell them how to survive, I just told them they already had. The foundation we built from the lawsuit, money had taken on a life of its own. Within months, we had offers to partner with shelters, legal aid groups, and even a few churches that had turned a blind eye for too long. For every rejection letter I received from a glossy institution uncomfortable with our tone, I got 2 more hand-signed notes from women who finally felt seen. And I had no interest in being palatable. Not anymore. I had spent too many years folding myself into a version of womanhood that didn't ruffle feathers, a version that apologized before speaking, that made coffee before saying no, that handed over power under the illusion of love. Those days were over. Grant and Veronica didn't come back, not even for the final verdict announcement. Their assets had been seized, Veronica's license suspended, Grant's position terminated after the board discovered the full extent of his forged authorizations. I never cheered, not out loud. But when I stood in the courtroom and watched the judge declare my rights fully restored, I smiled the smallest smile I had ever worn. Not because they lost, but because I didn't. That was enough. Ruth moved in with me not long after. She said her apartment was too quiet, and her knees too tired to keep climbing 3 flights of stairs. We drank our tea at 5 every evening. We laughed about the headlines that still made their rounds, the widow who took down her son. But we never needed to explain what really happened. The people who mattered already knew. Sometimes I would find old photos buried in boxes. A younger me, a younger Grant, eyes full of promise and hope. I never burned them. I never hid them. I simply placed them in the cedar chest beneath my bed, where old memories lived without needing to rise again. By summer, the roses had begun their climb. They curled around the porch rails like arms embracing a future not yet written. The neighbors stopped by more often, some with pies, some with questions, some just to sit in the shade and breathe in the peace that now lived on that hill. I didn't give speeches. I didn't wear victory like a crown. I just showed up, day after day, as myself, whole, weathered, and wide awake, because that, I realized, was the real triumph. Not the headlines, not the settlement, but the quiet reclaiming of self, the rebuilding of a life not around the pain, but beyond it. And in that space, I found joy. Not the loud kind, the kind that hums softly under the surface, like wind through the leaves, like laughter shared in low voices over dinner, like forgiveness not given to others, but offered gently to yourself. I still get letters sometimes, from women I've never met, from daughters watching their mothers suffer, from mothers watching their children become strangers. They don't ask for magic, just truth. And I give it to them, plain and unwavering, the kind that says, "You are not alone. You never were." If you've ever felt dismissed, taken advantage of, or quietly erased by the people you love most, know this: your story doesn't end there. You can draw the line. You can take back the pen. And even if the world never claps for you, your peace is the loudest applause. I told mine. Now maybe it's time to tell yours. In your own words, at your own pace. You deserve to be heard. You always did. You